Welcome back to the Open Classroom. We're dealing with media and public policy this semester. We're delighted to see you here, those of you who are in the room. And I can tell you that we have already started with a preliminary discussion with a number of our students. So our guest speakers are primed and ready to go. With that comment, I will turn the microphone over to my colleague, Jonathan Coughlin. Jonathan?
Okay, I'm going to be turning it over to Professor Jill Abramson, but I just wanted to briefly introduce the folks joining us. On the Zoom, we have Emily Ramshaw, who is the editor-in-chief of The 19th, which is a relatively new publication focusing on women's issues, also LGBTQ issues. And she's going to be talking a little bit at the beginning about the publication and how it started from the journalism side. We have Sophia Downs, who's head of Harvard Students for Life, was the head of Harvard Students for Life, and has been very involved in discussions on the pro-life side. And then Professor Martha Davis from the law school here at Northeastern, who has been deeply involved for many years on human rights, reproductive rights, but also in conversations that have been going on about what strategy the pro-choice movement should be taking in light of the Dobbs decision and the expectations of what's going to happen on the Supreme Court. But I'm going to turn it over to Jill to maybe talk to Emily a little bit about, and have her talk to us a bit about the 19th.
Hi, Emily. It's great to have you with us. I'm grateful to you for giving us your time, as are the students and my fellow professors and our guest lecturers today. And Jonathan sort of teed it up, but can you tell everyone about the 19th and just how you came to found it? And maybe a little bit about what your prior journalism experience was?
I'm Emily Ramshaw. I'm the co-founder and CEO of The 19th, which is a national nonprofit newsroom at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. So what we really deeply focus on is coverage that affects specifically women of color, primarily, and the LGBTQ community. And we're about 3 years old. So in the launch window of The 19th, we've sort of existed throughout the course of a pandemic, all the way through the Dobbs decision, and obviously reproductive health and abortion has been a really central and pivotal arena of our coverage for the last few years.
I guess one of the questions that Jill had asked earlier was how the fact that people were so surprised by the Dobbs decision. What's your sense, looking at journalists? Were we right to be surprised, or when you look at it now, does it feel like the press somehow dropped the ball?
Oh, I often feel like the press drops the ball. I think at the end of the day, the conversations that were happening in American media, look, like I still think newsrooms are overwhelmingly in this country progressive places that are centered in urban parts of the country, and where there's a little bit of a disconnect from the true voting populace. And I think I've spent most of my career, I live in Texas, I live in Austin, and I spent, about a dozen years prior to launching the 19th at the Texas Tribune. When you cross the American South, when you're in these communities that are outside of the urban core, I think you got a deeply strong sense that the way that public opinion at least appeared to be moving from those most vocal in this space was toward greater restrictions on abortion access. Now, I have opinions on the more recent polling and what we've seen since Dobbs, but I think it should not have been a big surprise that this particular Supreme Court was going to act in this particular way around abortion.
Sophia Downs is here. She's the head of Harvard Students for Life. And I'm wondering, Sophia, if you could come up here, and if you can talk into the computer, then Emily can hear us and use this at the same time, this microphone, and we can get kind of both of you. But I guess one thing I wanted to ask both of you is, Sophia, from your point of view, do you feel the press, the media has done a fair job covering the pro-life position, or do you feel that you've kind of been under siege? And you said that when you were at Harvard, you went to the first Students for Life meeting, and they said if you want to be anonymous, then we don't have to identify you. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, and then maybe Emily can respond.
I think a lot of what journalists choose to cover and whatnot. I generally believe in striving towards journalistic objectivity, and I think that journalists do a fair enough job striving for that objectivity in what they cover, in terms of how they cover things, but not necessarily in what they cover. So that being said, I think that generally, I will confess, I think I just lost that. Okay, primarily reading sort of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, places that tend towards coverage that's much more likely going to be pro-choice than pro-life. I think oftentimes hearing a pro-life perspective feels like an afterthought in some of these news organizations, or something that needs to be done to, sort of check the box of hearing the other side versus something that's truly represented.
Emily, could you talk a little bit about what you've directed the coverage in the 19th and what gaps you're trying to fill, but also what some of your reporters are finding, especially on the kind of political landscape of how Dobbs is playing out and how abortion will be playing out in the election?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I feel very strongly, both given my journalistic background and the work at the 19th, that we have a deep responsibility to cover everyone with empathy, to understand the reasons that people come to their particular individual decisions about abortion and reproductive health, which can be very personal and very deeply felt. So that's important to us. And we have reporters in 25 states doing that work. I mean, I think, what's really interesting to me about the politics of this moment is that we've seen in the 14 months since Dobbs that 15 states have enacted near total bans. 2 states have imposed 6-week limits, but at the same time, we've seen a whole series of ballot measures that have actually revealed popular support for abortion rights in a lot of states that I think many of us thought were very strongly red or purple. So that's been a really interesting political dynamic to watch. In Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana, there were measures brought by abortion opponents to further restrict the procedure that failed. We've seen a really interesting combination that I think says a lot about what we should expect to see in 2024. Certainly, abortion was an enormous factor in the midterms in 2022. You saw a lot of sort of competing voices and a lot of sort of heightened engagement around that issue at the national level. And I think I can speak further to this. I want to hear more on your end, but I can speak further to how I think there, could be parallels between 2022 and 2024, and the ways that we're already seeing that play out with politicians who are on the campaign trail. But it's been really fascinating to watch states take this into their own hands and see what different engagement and mobilization looks like around this issue.
If you could take us to those comparisons of 2022 and 2024, does this feel like that wave is going to continue?
I mean, I think what's going to be really interesting to see is whether, look, a lot of people anticipated a red wave in 2022. And, we're not sure that people were going to be really mobilized on the abortion issue. And it did turn out that voters were mobilized and were engaged and came out. And I think, Republicans did not see the gains that they thought they were going to see in 2022 as a result. I think the big question for 2024, you are seeing a lot of Republicans who are maybe trying to evolve their views in this moment because they don't want to see the same outcomes they saw in 2022. So you have, Donald Trump on one end of the spectrum saying that, Ron DeSantis did a quote terrible thing and made a terrible mistake when he signed Florida's 6-week abortion ban. Nikki Haley, has come out calling for a consensus on abortion, saying that she does see a federal role in the debate, but she's declining to endorse a national ban on the procedure. And so I think you are seeing, Republicans trying to figure out how to have this conversation around abortion in 2024 in a way that is not damaging to their political aspirations. So I think for Democrats, it's really going to come down to, are people still mobilized on abortion? Are Democrats still mobilized on abortion in 2024 the way they were in 2022, or have they kind of moved on?
What do you think the strategy should be among candidates, largely Republican?
I think that candidates should be authentic. You've seen in the Republican first debate, there was a variety of thoughts as to what should go, whether it be to the states or whether it be federally. I think they need to be in line with what the voters are feeling and with their plan. So no particular strong feeling there.
Although it seemed that in class, one of the things you were saying, it felt like you were trying to open up a dialogue. And I wonder if you think that's something that pro-life folks need to do more of.
Absolutely. I think that's universal, that both pro-life and pro-choice individuals need to act with more empathy in the way that they approach the issue. I think that there's a lot of militant rhetoric from both sides, and I think that fundamentally I have a firm belief that both pro-life and pro-choice voters, for the most part, are acting out of sincere intentions to do what's best for women and to do what's best for families. And so I think operating from that assumption changes the way that you treat others, changes the ways that you engage, and gets into a wider conversation about American dialogue and how we interact as a country.
But in being a realist, it seems to me we're still in a moment where the country's political dialogue is still sharply polarized.
Yes.
And in some ways, I think that's also reflected in some of the coverage, although part of why I value the 19th so much is I think that the coverage there is quite nuanced without being, on the one hand, on the other, simplistic. But I guess, the more polarized views are seen politically as bringing out base voters, which is obviously critical, not only in a general election, but in any of the ballot initiative fights or in states that elect state Supreme Court justices in those campaigns. So I question what, I think your optimism is praiseworthy, but perhaps, I hate to use the word naive, but I'm going to.
No, please do.
Let me bring in Professor Davis on that. You've been involved in these issues, for decades. What's your sense about where the debate is going and what role pro-choice folks should have in that role?
Sure. So one thing I'm going to say, though, is that she started out with the premise that, can people hear me?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, the premise that we were people, that journalists, I guess, were surprised by the outcome of Dobbs. And I'll just say that litigators and lawyers who work in this area were really not surprised. This had been coming for a long time. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was decided in 1992, was decided in a way that held Roe just by the skin of their teeth, by having 3 justices come together in a joint opinion that was unprecedented. And so that was the surprise, is that Planned Parenthood versus Casey was overturned Roe. And then we had a series of cases after that where every case we expected Roe to be overturned. And by the time Dobbs came up, there had just been 2 cases, Holmes Health and Medical, in the prior 2-3 years, 4 years, where again, the Roe was being chipped away. So it wasn't a surprise at all for people that are working in the area. So that, I guess, maybe says something about journalism. Why is it the journalists were surprised about this? In terms of going forward, I guess the one thing about Dobbs, it was, we had a path to reach a different result at Dobbs. You saw in the concurrence from Chief Justice Roberts that he would have upheld a 15-week, abortion period. And there was some expectation that might be part of a continued gradual, kind of chipping away at Roe. And so I guess maybe the surprise was that the court skipped a step and went to the point of overturning Roe. But given the composition of the court, it really wasn't a surprise. So in the wake of Dobbs, there's There are things that can be done through federal litigation, but the main activity now is at the state level. Folks are sort of forced to focus on the states because of the language of Dobbs that eliminates at least the liberty provision of the Equal Protection Clause from the equation. And so at the state level, there are 50 state constitutions. Those state constitutions, some of them are similar to the federal constitution, but some of them are different, and there are different provisions. In particular, 34 state constitutions have what's called a natural rights clause, which says that there's a right to happiness and well-being and natural rights that the state constitution protects. Federal constitution doesn't have that, so that's an area of litigation. To the extent that we've seen state courts like Oklahoma and I think it was South Dakota and I might be getting the state wrong, maybe North or South Carolina, say that they're not going to go so far, in Indiana actually, not going to go so far as to force women to give up their lives in order to save a fetus. Yep. People give up their lives in order to save a fetus. That's because of the provision of the state constitution that says that there's a right to life. There's a state constitutional right to life in these natural rights clauses. So federal constitution doesn't have that, but that's been at least so far a line over which beyond which the state courts aren't willing to go either, to say that even if someone is facing, a high risk of death, that they cannot get an abortion. And so one approach now is to work on the development of those state constitutional provisions. They haven't been litigated very much. They haven't been litigated very much at all, over the years, because it wasn't necessary to look to the state constitutions. But that's one area that people are very active in. And of course, there are other strategies, including federal legislation, the Women's Health Protection Act, which is pending. An area of specialization that I have is looking at international comparative law. That was an issue in the Dobbs case with both the majority and the dissent citing international comparative law. And, we know that the international trend is really towards liberalization of abortion. People probably read that Mexico has now decriminalized abortion. There's a vote going on in Brazil. So the U.S. becomes more isolated in its retrenchment.
I just asked Emily to talk about, they've done a lot of polling at the 19th on this issue, and I'm wondering what the polling is showing the country and voters where they're falling on the abortion issue now.
I mean, there are clues in the polling. So for decades, most Americans preferred making abortion illegal in all or most circumstances, which was sort of an ongoing Gallup poll that they did over time. But it appears that in the last 2 years, the numbers have really started to shift. Now, according to the most recent Gallup polling, more than half of Americans believe abortion is, quote, morally acceptable, and that the laws governing it are too strict in some cases. The 19th, we do a big national poll every year on tons of different topics. Abortion is just one of them. And our own polling, which came out last week, found that the vast majority of Americans, so 7 in 10 Americans, think that politicians are not informed enough about abortion to create fair policies. And in that same poll, only 9% of respondents believe that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances, even though 14 states are already enforcing near total bans on the procedure. So that's a little bit of sort of the Gallup history and also what our most recent 2 years of polling shows.
And do you feel that the politicians understand that, or are the policies kind of coming out of that, or are they still locked in the past?
I mean, I think they are locked in the past, and I think some of the challenge with that is that you look like the Republican Party is even divided on this issue. I mean, they're not monolithic even in the Republican Party, and so I think what you see are the people who win primaries are the most conservative voters. I mean, if you look at a state like Texas, for example, where there's an enormous divide between the far right and sort of the more centrist right on abortion and a whole wide range of issues. But I think when the either most conservative or most progressive folks are the ones making it through the primary system in this country and getting elected to office, you end up with a situation in which the folks in the electorate are largely out of touch with the majority of the American population.
I want to ask both you and Professor Davis this question, which is about strategy. And this is stepping out from maybe your editor-in-chief role to kind of more in an analysis. I mean, do you feel that the Democrats are coming up with a good strategy to deal with this post-Dobbs world? Or is there more they have to do or approach things differently? You know, a lot of people feel that, you know, we're going to have this court probably for the next 10, 20 years. And, you know, what does that mean? And how should pro-choice advocates approach it?
Right. I mean, I think I'll just answer quickly and pass it off. But I think, when you talk to Democrats, I think quietly they will say they are very nervous about 2024. They feel like they don't have the momentum or the interest that they even had as recently as 2022. I think the strategy in the states really has been these sort of citizen-led ballot propositions to further sort of codify abortion rights in the states. And I actually think that has been way more successful than a lot of them imagined that it would be. And so they are continuing to sort of beat that drum. I mean, I think looking at some of the states, there are campaigns in Missouri, South Dakota, Florida, Arizona, and others to put abortion initiatives on the ballot. And so these are increasingly citizen sponsored. And, I think they've seen traction in states like Michigan, Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana, and they're going to keep pushing at the state level.
Okay, I'm going to turn this over now to Professor Davis, and then we're going to open it up to questions. And I'll just repeat the questions for you.
So I'd really say the same thing. Of course, litigators will litigate, and the Supreme Court isn't going to be changing anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that we don't have theories and ideas about how to challenge this. But I think there'd be pretty uniform acknowledgement that the real strategy is electoral. That it's got to be getting people out, people who. As the polls reflect, majority would support more progressive, abortion access, making sure that those people are voting. And I'll just remind people, too, that to the extent that there is litigation going on in the states now, and there's a lot of it, in many states, not in Massachusetts, but in many states, state court judges are elected, too. So we're talking not just about these referenda, but also getting people out to vote in other kinds of elections.
Do you pick up among, say, the advocates or activists you speak to what Emily talked about, which is that there doesn't seem to be as much momentum on the pro-choice side or the anti-Dobbs side as in 2022, that it may not mobilize people to the same extent?
Yeah, I guess, I haven't done any polling for sure. It's still affecting people the same way that it did the first day it came down. And so I guess my perception has been that, yes, pro-choice folks have figured out some ways to help people travel across state lines and so on, but, many people are not getting helped, and there are so many tragic stories out there that, in my perception, is they're still motivating people. I mean, the people no doubt have read about the case in Texas with women who faced serious health issues and were not able to get abortions because of the chilling effect that the law there had on abortion providers. So I feel like, if anything, the harm is spreading, and people understand it more now than they did when Dobbs first came down.
I'd like to open it up to the students and to others in the audience. What I'd ask is that you come down here so when you ask your question, Emily can hear it. And one of the things in the class that we were discussing was this kind of, is there kind of some sort of meeting of the minds that can take place? Sophia, who had to get back to one of her own classes, was sort of saying, that people need to have empathy and listen to each other. And I'm wondering, from the students here or others, do you feel that empathy is possible, or have we passed that point? Somebody want to come down and ask about that or talk about it? Please think of some questions, because then I'll ask another one. Okay. So let me ask you, what's your sense about where, the abortion debate stands, and, either your own feelings or where you think things might be able to go?
So the way I understand it, hopefully Emily can hear me from the laptop and I can use the microphone. And let me just say, I've been coming here for 8 years, okay? Long time, except during the COVID suspension. I'm probably the age of most of your mothers. So I remember in the 70s fighting virulently for the right to have abortions, to make our choices. And at that time, as well as now, there was a tremendous amount of opposition. And we felt that we made progress through the proper channels with a loud voice. I'm hopeful that there are people, as they take their positions, that they use the proper channels, but you have to use a loud voice. If you don't, you get nowhere. And I hate the concept of dividing our country into haves and have-nots, where the have-nots are losing their options in many ways because of economics and rural environments, and in communities where there isn't justice economically. So I have a longer view that we've given back or had taken away from us rights that we had decades ago, and I am not happy.
Okay. Carlita, can I put you on the spot? Could you come down and talk about a little bit what we talked about in class?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, Emily. Thank you for being here. Hey, classmates and all that are here today. But I had a comment in class following Sophia, who is pro-life, and she made a statement that she believes that pro-life is pro-woman. And in my listening to her, I found it challenging to kind of get her point of view, because it sounded, she was sharing that she believes that there should be more resources for abortions and just overall, just, sorry, for adoption. Just, it sounded like she was pro-resources, which I am for too. In addition to that, it also reminded me of a reading we did this past week, and I was gonna start off with a statement that I really resonate with, is which beyond pro-choice and pro-life and Democrat and Republican, I just understand, this sounds like more of a power and control thing. Why is it that there is a party or that there's a group of people that is trying to decide what I should do with my body? So I guess I'm challenged with, this is the state of the reality, that we have, political parties telling us what to do, but I am thinking beyond that and wonder if this is like a power and control thing. I don't have no right to tell anyone in this room what they can and cannot do beyond my own beliefs. So I am struggling and challenged with how pro-life is pro-woman. Thank you.
Were you able to hear any of that, Emily? If not, I'll put it in the chat.
I was able to hear it, yes.
What do you think that's an argument that resonates among women and among voters?
Well, I mean, I think it sort of depends on what side of this issue you come down on. I mean, there are, again, like I live in a very conservative state where there are, very strong views that that life begins at conception and that abortion ends a human life. And there are also very many folks on the other side of the aisle who feel that this is, abortion restrictions really put a woman's life in danger. That, there are so many states now that have these abortion laws that have no exceptions for rape or incest. I think there are very polarized views on this and very strong opinions on both sides of this issue. I think, what's been really interesting for me and frustrating for me to watch in a state like Texas is, we have a legislature that is incredibly anti-abortion, and yet there has not been an increase in resources for things like, Medicaid or children's health, for the kind of services, CHIP, the kind of services that, children in poverty in Texas need. I mean, I think to me, the sort of, if you're pro-life, it should extend all the way through the life of the mother, the life of these children once they're here. And I think that's a difficult irony that has not, that has been, I think, hard to stomach in states that have very stringent abortion laws. So I think, I mean, look, like, everybody gets to have their own view and their own opinion on this. I understand the young person who came up and spoke just now. Sorry, I don't know who you are. Your view really resonates with me, and I understand how tough it is to reconcile those two things. But I'm sure Sophia has a very different opinion and a very different case to make.
And do you see any possibility of those views reconciling? And I'm going to ask Professor Davis the same thing. I mean, is this polarization just the way it's going to be? I mean, there was a time, I guess, when Clinton ran for president, where there was this idea that we'll make abortion, safe and rare, that there was common ground.
I mean, this didn't used to be such a hot button issue, right? Like there was a time in the not very distant history where, most people believed this case law was settled, and that there was, and that there was a middle ground on this particular issue. I mean, I think the challenge with all of this is we've now moved so far away from that. And I actually think that the Supreme Court's opinion does not accurately reflect the public opinion on this issue. And I think if you watch what's happening in Central and South America, if you watch the way the tide is turning there, if you watch the legislation and ballot measures in states across the US where voters are actually further codifying abortion rights, it does increasingly feel like this court was just supremely out of touch with the American public.
Mr. Davis, can I ask you to come up and talk a little bit about, I don't know if it's reconciliation or meeting of the minds?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I really support that exactly, because I do think that it's a rights issue, and rights are a fundamental right is not something that you compromise around. But having said that, I think that there are reasons why. Reasons beyond that, why a pro-choice position should be the baseline. And one is that, the idea that we live in a pluralistic society. Some of the litigation that's pending around the country, particularly in Indiana, is based on religion, based on the idea that the restrictions in some of the states violate other people's religions, while the anti-abortion position seems to often reflect a more Catholic or more evangelical religious position. So one thing is thinking about to what extent should we really be codifying those kinds of things into law, or should we really have a legal system that allows for more pluralism. I'll say too that we know that, as Emily was saying, there was a time in the U.S. where things weren't so polarized, and they're not so polarized in many of our peer countries. So for the Dobbs case, I worked on an amicus brief that surveyed other countries around the world to see what kind of policies they had. And so I talked to people, around the world, women around the world, activists around the world, about what their experiences were in their countries. And in the UK and Canada, in Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands, and some of those countries are ones that we share deep histories with, like Canada and the UK. They are just sort of astonished that things in the US are so polarized. In those places, abortion is viewed as a health care issue, not as a political football. So it is possible in a liberal democracy to have a different approach.
Sure, but you need, and actually.
Yeah, the question is this yes, the question is this a states' rights issue? It is now, because the Supreme Court has told us that it is, but I don't think it should be. I think it's a matter of federal constitutional law. I don't think the Dobbs case was rightly decided, and there are still other arguments that could be made in the future, probably not with the Supreme Court, about federal constitutional protections, looking into other parts of the Constitution, or maybe even revisiting Dobbs. So I think that's the
hope eventually is to have the right to abortion established as a federal right. but Dobbs just came down a couple of years ago. There's no point in going back to the same Supreme Court now on that issue. And so right now we're litigating the states. There are examples where states have developed law that then filters up over time to the federal level. And so that might be something that happens over time. I mean, you talked about taking a long view. This is a time when, you know, the long view is what we have to work with because the Supreme Court, they're life appointed, they're a lot of young, relatively young members, and we're not likely to get a we would not get a Dobbs reversal if we tried to go back up on that issue.
Okay, we have a couple of students. Why don't you just shout it out and I'll repeat it.
I'm gonna come down, I don't mind.
Okay.
Remember, laptop and microphone.
We have a student coming down with a question.
All right. I have a question regarding the fact that 6 of the Supreme Court justices and the 6 who voted to overturn Roe it's regarding the fact that they were raised Catholic, although one of them is now Episcopalian. And with the rise of Christian nationalism in the US, are we going to see more theocratic decisions, specifically with the way that Thomas, in his dissent, referenced Obergefell versus Hodges, and 2 other cases that I'm forgetting their names, but Griswold, but are we going to see more theocratic decision-making in the US?
Were you able to hear that, Emily?
I mean, I would say we already are, and we already have. Again, you know, all I have to do is use my my experience here in Texas, covering the legislature here in Texas, where a lot of these legislators are making, you know, making legal decisions based on their religious beliefs, and I think you see it, you know, not just in abortion, you see it in conversations around LGBTQ rights. You see it around, you know, questions of gender affirming care, around the you know, role of trans athletes in sports. I think it's becoming increasingly common, you know, and that we're seeing it across all kinds of policy arenas, not just the reproductive rights space.
I would just like to give a little background on someone that many of you have been reading about lately, who's plays a key role in all of that, and that is Leonard Leo, who was the longtime chairman of the Federalist Society and was its incredibly successful fundraiser. And there are a number, I don't know, you know, what our law professor thinks of this, but there are a number of respected law professors at different law schools, including one I taught to regularly at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, who truly believe that the 6 conservative and Catholic justices on the court now do want a kind of theocratic approach to government. And they haven't been paid as much attention to as Dobbs or many of the other kind of hot button cases, but there are all these cases that fall under the rubric, which I think has an unfortunate name, called religious liberty cases. And they have involved decisions in the past couple of years where a majority of the court has lowered the wall of separation between church and state. And those decisions range from, in Maine, being able to use state funding to restore a playground in a parochial school, or the Coach Kennedy case, where a football coach was doing on-field prayer with his team in Louisiana, and that was deemed constitutional. There's the Little Sisters of the Poor case, and the most famous is probably the Hobby Lobby case, which Justice Gorsuch wrote the decision at the appellate court level that, basically gave, Hobby Lobby, a private company, the ability to withhold contraceptive and other services to its employees. These are really important decisions in the realm of, they call it religious freedom. I'll just call it religion or separation of church and state. And there are more coming down the pike this term. And it's worth certainly the press focusing some attention on these cases, which, in my opinion, haven't received enough coverage. And the importance of Leonard Leo is that he employed the same techniques that the Koch network employed in politics earlier to, take over state governments and various other parts of the government, using conservative side, dark money groups who could raise and spend unlimited sums of money without disclosing their donors. Leonard Leo imported those techniques to the courts. And too little attention, I fault myself, because, after the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill hearings, I spent 3 years writing a book about why Clarence Thomas won confirmation. And those very reasons then continued to have a very strong afterlife. And the conservative movement, very much allied with Catholic organizations, really went about a very disciplined and well-organized campaign to take over not only the Supreme Court, which they succeeded in, thanks to the weirdnesses that elected Donald Trump, but which gave them three spots on the court. But in trying to remake the federal district courts and the very influential appellate level courts, and it was. Leonard Leo was not the only general in that campaign, but years ago, the news media should have been all over that story, because it's resulted in, and again, back to abortion, the views that are minority views, in terms of the people of the United States, becoming the law of the land in a number of different areas, most notably abortion, but in many others too. There's a case coming up in the current term that challenges something obscure called the Chevron rule, which basically gives the executive branch the power to regulate. And if the court, with the 6-member conservative majority, has shown a real hostility to regulation and an extreme friendliness to corporate interests, and that could further obliterate environmental rules and restrictions on carbon emissions and all of the things that are now being done to reverse climate change could be swept away. So it's a huge story, the capturing of the courts, not only the Supreme Court, but all of the federal courts. And even as we're seeing in some of the state court battles over abortion, where state Supreme Courts are elected. The right has not in Wisconsin, where there was an absurdly expensive race with both sides pouring in money for a state Supreme Court seat where the pro-choice side won. But in other battles in other states, the pro-life side and the conservative side of things has prevailed. So I think it's one of the biggest undercovered news stories of my professional life.
Okay, Emily has to leave, but I wanted to give her one chance just to kind of sum up and sort of share your thoughts about, in general, where the media should be going, and also the role of a kind of woman-centered, LGBTQ-centered publication in covering this.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so I think from the standpoint of the role of an organization like ours in covering this, I think there is media fatigue, right? A lot of the national news organizations have moved away from the narrative around abortion and reproductive health. And for an organization like ours, it really is front and center. And we feel like we have a responsibility to continue to make it front and center. I think when it comes to this election cycle and the responsibility that the media has, I think the one thing I'd say is I'd reflect on 2022 when so many news organizations were predicting a red wave, were predicting that, it would be the economy that would be driving voters to the polls, and really were dismissive of the idea that abortion might be a driver of electoral outcomes in 2022. And I think they got it wrong because they weren't on the ground. They weren't talking to people out, to real voters out in the world. And I think, one of the things I was really proud of with the 19th is we wrote, I think, close to 70 stories ahead of the midterms, and not a single one of those stories predicted a red wave because we were talking to women, we were talking to LGBTQ plus folks, we were hearing what was driving them to the polls. And so I think that's, to me, the cautionary tale for 2024 is make sure news organizations that you're actually talking to those voters on the ground. And thank you all for including me. I'm sorry it was complex for me not being able to hear you all, but I really appreciate being included tonight.
No, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. So, Professor Davis, let me ask you back to the kind of theocracy question, which is, are you worried about that, as Elle was saying, that this is a bigger issue than just abortion, but there's a broader kind of theme behind this, and also Jill's talking about the role of the various, dark money groups?
So thanks for that question. So I'm not a First Amendment scholar, but everybody at the Legal Academy understands the direction that the court has been going in terms of the eroding the separation of church and state. So I think that's absolutely right, and it's shocking. It's involved, just as precedent was overturned in the Dobbs case, it's involved also departure from prior precedent, routinely in these other kinds of cases. So I'll leave it there. I think that's what I have to say about that. One thing I was going to say, because we've kind of painted a maybe not hopeless, but the idea that the Supreme Court is just beyond control, right? They're there for life. They're young. They're doing what they feel like. They're overturning precedent. And that's true, but it's also true that historically there has been some response that the Supreme Court has to social movements. And we were talking earlier about the marriage equality campaign, which was something that people thought was impossible, and yet by strategic litigation and strategic use of imagery and the media and so on, folks were able to move that issue up to a Supreme Court that was not particularly liberal at the time, more liberal than now, but not historically on the liberal side, and prevail on an issue that was one that people hadn't been able to imagine would prevail, maybe a generation before. So even with this court, and we've kind of alluded to it a few times, there's a sensitivity to public opinion. And so to the extent that they think they've gotten out too far in the Dobbs case, and we let them know that they have, the next case may not be quite as dramatic a departure from a precedent. So there is some give and take between social movements and the Supreme Court. I know the other thing I was going to say about the theology issue is that that's also not new. And Justice Kennedy, I don't remember when he came on the court, but he very notably began using in his opinions language from Catholic theology, which scholars picked up on, and we tried to use that. He referred a lot to dignity, human dignity, and that's not in the Constitution. That's something that's part of Catholic theology. It's also in human rights language, and so lots of us sort of picked up on that to try to appeal to Kennedy. And so it's sort of it feeds on itself to some extent, because lawyers, of course, are trying to develop arguments that are going to sway the Supreme Court. And so if they see them going in the direction of like adopting sort of Catholic philosophy, that's what litigators might do in order to prevail in a case, So that's the question. It's like, where do you draw the line? Where do you say, no, we can't go in that direction. We've got to find another way to win, when the court is inviting you to adopt a different kind of approach.
I think there was another question that was up there. Okay. Ted, let me ask you from kind of a perspective of, not having a dog in this fight, not being in the media, but being a lawyer. When you look at this question of social movements, do you feel there is going to be kind of an uprising that can continue? We had the Women's March. We heard there were some protests when Dobbs came down. Do you sense that there could be another kind of social movement built around these issues, or are people kind of worn down? And that's also a question, I think, for the students here. Like, do you feel you have it in you to kind of take to the streets or do what might be necessary to create this different atmosphere? Oh, please, someone get a... Thanks.
I'll say in brief that for me the social movement is at the ballot box at this point. And I think that people have taken to the streets. I think that what seems to be influencing policy as much as anything is election outcomes, which we've seen in the last year or so. And I think that it is going to take a great deal of work to get people away from their screens and into polling places where they will actually be voting this year and most particularly next year, both in local and national elections. And I think that there's a major role for demonstrations, social movements, writing, but I think it's really about organizing and getting people to the polls.
I'll just do this. I was an abortion organizer in Florida and up in the South. And so, like, coming here, Boston bubble is very true. In the way that I think it's shocking that everyone else was shocked. As an organizer, notoriously, like every organization I work with, we're underfunded, undersupported. And I think that has a lot to do with why we're not so successful. Like, you can have a voice, but if you're not being funded, you're not being supported in the way that the right is. I mean, if you look at Phyllis Schlafly, when she started, in the 70s, decimating ERA, and like the students were like, such a behemoth of a movement. I just feel like the left hasn't really gotten that yet, and I don't know if and I know like organizers work with litigators too. I don't know if you felt that on your side as well, but organizers are the heart of any movement, but you can only do so much if you're not being like fully supported.
What happened when you looked for funding?
There is none. It goes to CEOs and executives of the nonprofits that are doing the organizing.
But I just feel like there's just not the behemoth that is like
the right with what the machine they have with, and I think and that's why they win is because they have the grassroots efforts. And even the Sophia, she said that earlier too.
I very much agree with Ted that, you know, the key battleground is the ballot box. And there are some very well-organized and well-funded abortion rights groups, whether, you know, everything from Emily's list, Planned Parenthood is still around. I mean, there's money and resources, and if you look at the recent election results, the pro-choice side has been winning. So it may be that, you know, I respect very much your experience on the ground, which is important, that you felt, you know, a lack of support and resources, and it may be that there's somehow a disconnect between national messaging and get out the vote efforts and local organizations, especially in places like Florida, which are such hostile environments for issues like abortion right now.
I'm going to disagree. I work for Planned Parenthood. They do not pay their organizers enough money to live. So you're not...
Right, but they're spending money on other things.
Spending money on a national level, when
Yeah.
they should be spending at the state level. That's why they lost the entire legislator and the executive people are unconsidered spending there.
Yeah, I would also add that looking back on social movements that have been successful over the last few decades, whether it's marriage equality or civil rights or a range of other things, college students have played a major role in moving the movements forward. People have gotten out on the streets, they've organized, they've put together not just demonstrations, but activities that, in fact, get people out to vote. And, you know, this coming year, you know, from here to the end of December, I would say, of 24 is a period for student activism, not just in terms of demonstrating, as was the case with Black Lives Matter, but also getting down on the ground into organizational roles where they're getting people out to vote and doing the writing and doing the research and working with the groups, whether the groups are well-funded or not, that make a difference.
In some ways, don't you think the civil rights movement is a model, especially voting rights, when students, you know, went down on buses to the South to actually register voters?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. And, you know, change does take place. I mean, the first time I went down to Washington when I was a kid with my mother, we couldn't use the bathrooms in Washington, D.C., in public places. People weren't voting. There weren't black and brown elected officials. And a lot of that changed because college students went out and organized, not just themselves, but other people, got involved in communities that they were unfamiliar with, and did mission-driven work to bring about change. And there's a lot of stuff that we take for granted right now. I mean, a lot of folks took women's rights for granted, and look at what happened because they got complacent about that stuff. So there's an opportunity in this concentrated period over the coming year to get out and organize off campuses and in communities where there's need.
I want to actually ask, sort of following up, but also asking Professor Davis her experience. There have been articles out there that are reporting that one of the things that may be hurting the pro-choice movement are, say, identity issues, or conflating issues where you have transgender issues, for example, with pro-choice. Ms. Magazine's been writing a little bit about this. And I wonder if you feel from a political point of view, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the right, they're incredibly disciplined, right? They stay on message, they are focused on what they're doing. And even with Sophia, I think, you could sense that while she can be very approachable, and I think a lot of her kind of wanting to engage is genuine, in the end, her views are not going to be that much different than a lot of other folks. And I'm not sure, whether liberals or pro-choice folks can follow that discipline, or has been the expansion of identity movements and so forth, kind of, I don't want to say muddling the waters, but reducing maybe the effectiveness, or maybe it's necessary. Why don't we ask you first?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, this is not really my expertise, but I think it's the nature of progressive movements. I don't think you can, and even though we've maybe seen, I know in the Kiara Bridges testimony in Congress where she insisted on referring to pregnant people, that she was then, her view was kind of marginalized by members of Congress. She was right, to do that. And that this is what the challenge is for organizers, is to address this, but not to say we're not going to be the same kind of movement. We're going to be a movement just for pregnant women. At least that's my view. I was going to say one other thing about talking about organizing. I mean, this is an issue. The issue of access to reproductive justice, is an issue that affects everyone so personally. I'm just thinking about college, and my own daughter's a college age. College age women especially have to think about where they're going to go to college, where are they going to live, and then when they graduate, when people graduate, where are they going to live? Are they going to live in a place where they can get access to health care, to full health care that they need? And so it seems to me that even though there are challenges for organizing for sure, this is also an issue that affects everyone on such a personal level that there's every reason to think that and we see it already, that people will come out and express their views on this because they've all had to think about it.
It's interesting, just back to abortion for a minute, to me that President Biden is of a generation and a background, he too was raised Catholic, and that he clearly has ambivalent personal feelings about the abortion issue, and he rarely speaks about it. I mean, Vice President Harris has absolutely been the voice on this issue, and I think she's been a very powerful voice, and for some reason gets little political or media credit for doing that hard work. But that the kind of discipline and unity that you see on the conservative side, just the somewhat lack of that is illustrated at the very top of a Democratic administration, which I think is interesting.
So I wonder whether some of this isn't a bit about we're protected in Massachusetts, or we're protected on the East Coast and the West Coast, and that our empathy as the country has divided is less for the folks of Florida and the folks of Texas who got themselves into this situation, or the folks in Kansas who may dig themselves out. And I have a demographic divide. I'm interested to know from the women here who are on social media whether they feel that they're involved in this conversation or whether they feel they've been isolated. And I don't know.
Just to talk about that slippery slope, you mentioned Griswold before, and of course there's litigation now going up challenging the availability of various kinds of contraception as well as mifepristone and so on. So it's not limited to abortion. It's a range of things about control of people's reproductive capacities and question, as you say, how far are we going to let it go?
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for their patience with our technological problems. We will endeavor to get them fixed by next time. But thank you all for coming and for a really kind of candid conversation. Thank you, Professor Davis. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Ted.